Hey there, Dango Stu here. Today's video is going to be on changing the drive shaft and the gear selector seals on the Evinrude 150 and is proudly sponsored by marineengine.com. In the past few videos I've sort of picked up in the workshop once all the parts have arrived. And given marineengine.com is the new sponsor of the channel, I thought it made a lot of sense to actually show you the earlier parts of the process where I try and get the parts I need. So what we'll do is I'll jump on the website, which unsurprisingly the URL is marineengine.com, and then I'll show you how I go about finding the parts I need for this Evinrude 150. So this particular screen is the home page there. So you can see there's engine parts, manuals, accessories, a forum, some really good information and some contact details. The way I prefer to use the site really is to go into a particular brand. In this case it's an Evinrude motor, so I'm just going to click on here. Now you can do particular model numbers, so we could type it in. I actually don't know my full model number because the sticker on the outboard is a little bit damaged. So what I'm going to do is go over here to just outboards, 1955 to present, and then look at the years. Now I know mine is a 97 because of the EU part of the model number that's on there. And I'll do a little explanation of how that sort of works a little bit down the track. Then I know it's a 150, so that's nice and easy. Once I'm looking down this list, I can see on mine that it's the EXE-UE, so that's the model I've got. I mean, the rest that's missing actually is pretty obvious. It's an Evinrude 150, so that sort of clears things up a bit. When I go into the actual specific outboard, I've got a few different options, which is common replacement parts, which is great if you're doing a service, and then there is the various parts diagrams. These parts diagrams are really handy when it comes to picking a very specific part you want to use for your outboard. But what I'm going to do is actually start by heading over here and just checking out the water pump kit, because I need pretty much all of this anyway. So here we can see there was an old one that's been superseded. So this is really what I want. I'll have a quick look what's in it. So we've got base plate, gaskets, all the usual things. So I'm just going to do add to cart and grab one of those while I'm here. It's worth me grabbing that because if I'm going to do the drive shaft seal, it's all below the water pump. Why not just do the whole water pump while you're there? Once I get back to these pumps, I'll just use the back button, get back to our main list. Then from here, I'm looking at this lower unit. So if I have a look down here, gear case, here we go. Gear case standard rotation for the 20-inch, that's the one I want. These parts diagrams are really handy. They're great for everything from figuring out how things go back together through to ordering bits you need. So I'll show you the bits I need to get this job finished now. In that original order, I did order some parts, some dust covers and things, and some seals. But what I didn't order was 23, I think, which is this seal that goes under the gear selector housing, because I'll be taking that off, so I'm going to replace that. So I'm going to come down here to 23. And you'll see here there's an original part number that you may have seen listed. That's why you may arrive at that, but this is the new one. And then there's some aftermarket ones. In this case, so this one's a 2-pack, and the aftermarket one's like 50 cents cheaper, so I'm just going to add the original Evinrude one to our cart. Now the other thing I was going to order was this part, which was 28.19. Looks like it had a washer. Actually, I might get two 19s because I don't think the tab on the bottom had a washer. And this 28, because we're missing one of those tabs on this outboard. Interestingly, once again, in these diagrams, they always tell you a lot of information. It looks here perhaps like there's only one. I'll go and have a look at, say, 28. We'll jump down, see what it says. Ah yes, 2 required. I only saw one on the parts diagram, but often you'll see this when you come down here. It'll tell you how many there are. So we're missing one. So I'm going to add a 28 and a 28A. The final thing I'm going to order is these plastic grills. I noticed that actually one on one side is actually damaged, so I'll get a new one of those just to make it a little bit nicer. I'll probably repaint the lower unit. The lower unit's not in great nick, and it's certainly no better after putting heat on it to get the bearing carrier out. Once you've got all the bits, it's pretty sort of standard after there. I'm just going to go to checkout. I've already got an account, so I'll log in and pay and do the usual sort of shipping and all that kind of stuff. But hopefully it gives you an idea how easy it is to order the bits you need from a parts diagram. They can look a bit confusing at first because it's just, you know, a huge page of parts, but they're really handy diagrams to have. They're great sources of information too. So if you're having a problem with your outboard and you're sort of, often I'll get a question, oh, where does this part go? What order these parts go in? You can actually jump on a site that sells parts and use diagrams like that to answer those questions really readily. So that's getting the bits. We'll pick this video up in about 4 seconds time when those parts have arrived. Through the magic of editing, these parts have arrived now, so we'll get on and we'll install the seals for the gear selector, the drive shaft seals, and the water pump kit. As before, here's our picking list, and all these little envelopes have got the part numbers on as well. So I'll just run through, see what we've got, and pick where to start. I think we'll start with the gear selector linkage, get that done, and then do the water pump. So here are our little water intake grills. Since this gearbox was last here, the owner took it away, gave it a bit of a sand and put some primer on it. So we'll replace these. The old ones have got paint on them, so as well as being a bit damaged, it'd be good to get new ones in there. Yes, we've also got the locking tab and nut, so we only ever had one of those locking tabs, so I'll put the other one in just to make it more complete. I can't see it falling out, but there's obviously two for a reason, so let's do it. Looks like this nut that comes supplied also has some Loctite on it, which is great. From the previous order, I've got this sort of dust cap seal that goes on the gear selector, and I've also got these O-rings that I believe go inside the housing. I've spoken to people who said, oh, I'm looking forward to seeing a video on that because they're really fiddly to do. And then my heart sank and I went, oh, are they? Oh well, we'll get there. The very first thing I do is wind out the drive shaft linkage. All I'm going to do now is, because I know I got that position measured quite right before in the previous video, so I'm going to measure how many winds it takes to come out, and that way I can just wind it in the same number again when I put it all back together. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Between 8 and 9, I'm going to say. I actually think this popped out at 8. I pulled it up and then gave it one more turn to be 9, but there's quite a bit of resistance on those O-rings. So you lift it thinking, oh, it's not quite disconnected, but I think it's just the O-ring resistance. There's 6 bolts around this housing that the O-rings go into, and they look to be 7/16, I think they are. I also can't recommend these little magnetic parts trays enough. Yeah, they're not good for aluminium or stainless parts, but it doesn't matter how small a job is, having somewhere to put a little bits as you take them out saves you a lot of headache down the track. I was expecting that to be quite stuck, but it was quite simple in the end. On the bottom here is the gasket, so I'm just going to take that out. It's a bit torn now. They very rarely come off in one piece, so if ever you're taking something apart like this and it has a gasket, I always recommend getting the gasket in advance because you're very, very rarely going to be able to reuse the old one with any success. I'll just scrape a little bit. You can see there's a little bit of remaining gasket on here, so I'll just scrape that off with a bit of a razor blade and then maybe put it on a brass wheel just to brush off the last little bit. The cleaner the surface, the better the new gasket's going to seal. These O-rings are a little bit tricky to fish out. That's not too bad. Stabbed it. But I hear they're going to be 10 times worse to get the new ones back in. So here are the old ones. I must have ordered 2 thinking they came individually, but they actually come as a set of 2, so I've ordered 2 sets. So I'll pop those in the spares. Alright, now I'm just going to clean this out with a bit of brake cleaner so I can get a better look. It looks like there are 2 individual grooves, so I'll probably put one in from the top here and one in from the bottom, I think. We'll see how that goes. So just usual routine, bit of brake cleaner, bit of a rag, give it a clean out. It looks to me, looking inside here, that there aren't 2 individual grooves. There's the housing here starts narrow, goes in, widens out,
and then becomes narrow again, which means these O-rings are just stacked inside a single groove. So I'm actually thinking I'm going to put them both in from the top here. Just had a quick look at the manual to see if there's any tips for installing these, and the instructions are install them, so clearly not. It does say to use a bit of grease on them, which makes sense, so I'll grab some grease, we'll put some on the O-rings and we'll just pop them in. It says to use triple guard grease, but I'm just using a bit of Yamaha grease. If the engine doesn't start when I'm finished, we know it's because I used the wrong grease. I'm thinking there's no real trick to this. I'm just sort of going to squeeze them, pop them in. Once I've pushed them in, to avoid the risk of puncturing them, I'm just going to use like a blunt sort of punch like this. And I'm going to seat that one down the bottom of the groove so the second one can go on top. So once again, I'm just going to give it a bit of a squeeze to elongate it. Once it's elongated, just push it in that way. And then use this punch to push the upper edge down. When I pushed it in, the bottom edge went in and sort of got a bit stuck inside the first O-ring. So I used this to sort of hook it back up and then push the low side down. So I think you need to do a little bit of hooking and a little bit of pushing to get them sort of both right. Yeah, it's a little bit fiddly, but I've certainly seen worse, so I think they're pretty settled now, which is good. Don't know if you can see through there, but that's the two O-rings in now. So now I'll just open the new gasket. I'll go and give the gearbox a wipe and we'll reassemble it. Just going to scrape a little bit of old grease off with this razor blade. Sometimes the bolt holes on these sorts of things are staggered, so they'll only go one way. But in this case, they actually look symmetrical, so pop our gasket down. Our housing with the new O-rings in it. I just double checked the manual then to see about whether I should be Loctiting these. They don't have any Loctite on them. But it actually says we should have a gasket sealing compound on this gasket. Most Yamaha stuff or whatever Honda stuff, you don't seal this, but it says to in this case. So I'm just going to spray these with a bit of Hylamar and then we'll install it. Hylamar is generally applied to the metal surfaces itself. In this case, I'm actually going to spray it on both sides of the gasket and let the gasket dry for about 10 minutes and then we'll install it. So we'll just coat both sides and I'll hang it up for 10 minutes. I'll just go over here in the spray booth first though. Alright, let's look at the water pump while we're waiting for that to dry. These are also 7/16. These bolts also look to be the exact same length as the ones for the gear selector housing, only they don't appear to have washers with them. Whether they don't need them or whether they've been lost over time, who knows. It's probably another example where a parts diagram would help you answer that question. To make it a little bit easier to slide the impeller off and put the new one on, I'm just going to get a little bit of very fine sandpaper and just clean this corrosion off the drive shaft. Here I'm just using a bit of brake cleaner to try and help dissolve this crud. Plenty of other things you could use. To get this impeller up, I'm just going to use a pry bar. Maybe a bigger pry bar. Slide the old impeller up. There's an O-ring just under it. And the base plate. I'll go pop these on the bench and I'll go and compare all the bits and see what I've got in that repair kit that I got from marineengine.com, and we'll see what bits we've got to replace and what we have to reuse. Underneath the housing here we've got a bit of a gasket that needs replacing, and we've got the housing here that contains the drive shaft oil seal that we're also going to replace. So this is the oil seal for the drive shaft that I got in the previous order. I'll now take out these bolts and see if we can lift this housing up. These bolts are slightly different to the others, so I'll just keep them aside so I know they go back with this oil seal housing. So just using a couple of screwdrivers to lift this up as straight as I can. Alright, I'll get this housing onto the bench now. On the underside of this oil seal holder, we've actually got the bearing for the drive shaft here. There's an O-ring in here, which I don't have a new one of, but it doesn't look too damaged. So I'm going to clean it up, put a bit of grease on it, we'll reuse that, and then I'll replace this oil seal here. This oil seal actually didn't look like a tight fit around the drive shaft at all, so I'm starting to suspect this is where the water was getting in. Going to use this seal puller to get the old seal out. As always, this oil seal is pretty stuck, so I'm a bit worried I'm going to sort of eventually slip and just end up putting this through my hand. So I'm going to gently put this in a vise and try and lever it out. If I can't, all I'm going to do is punch it out from this side. Actually, you know, that's what I'm going to do to start with. The main reason I'm going to do that is I don't really want to put any pressure on this bearing housing at all, whereas I can lay this just down on the jaws of the vise with them open wide enough, and really easily I've got access, hopefully you can see, to the seal there, just to punch it through that way. There we go. There's the old oil seal out now. So I'll clean up the housing and we'll put the new one in. Got the new oil seal now. It goes in this way up, so this end faces towards the power head and this open end goes down towards the gearbox. I'm just going to put a little smear of grease around the outside of it. It's probably not quite enough. Just to make it a little bit easier to install and just to help it seal around the outside. Because this one sits flush, we can drive it all the way in with a socket, so I'm just going to find a socket that's the right size and then we'll tap it in. Looks like a 27mm socket's about right. It's not such an issue that the socket's bigger than the outside, but we don't want it crushing this inside spring or anything, and that fits on quite nicely. So we'll tap it down. So there we go, new oil seal in flush. I'm now going to put a little bit of grease around that O-ring before we reinstall it, and then we'll bolt it back down. I can already feel that oil seal is a much tighter fit than the original one was, which sort of confirms my suspicion this is where the water was getting in. Alright, that's seated down quite nicely. Just going to give these fasteners a little clean up, put a little bit of grease on them, tighten them up. Now they're all snug, just going to go and tighten them up a smidge so they've got an even pressure. Our gasket's been drying for 10 minutes now, so I'm ready to install that. We'll finish off the shift linkage, then we'll do the water pump. Just going to pop these fasteners through the housing and the gasket in a couple of places to keep it aligned. Same thing with this one, tightening in diagonals, moving round, firm even pressure, that's all that's needed. Now I'm just going to reinstall this shift rod. These parts are listed as the spacer and the grommet. So I'm just going to put a little bit of grease on the grommet because I've got to push the shift rod down the whole length of it. And then when we come down here, got to get this through the O-rings, the new O-rings. So I'm actually going to wind it and see if the thread bites into the O-rings and winds its way through, rather than risking pushing it and just pushing those O-rings back out the bottom. Once we get onto the smooth part of the shift linkage, I'm happy just to push it through. You got no choice. Wait until it bottoms out into the thread. Then I'm going to turn it one time clockwise and just see if I can lift it. I don't want to count turns where it hasn't actually mated with the female thread. Otherwise, you know, it's going to end up being too shallow. But that feels like that first turn did lock in. So that was 1. We'll go 2, 3, and 8. I think 8 is right. As I said, when I first took it out, I think maybe I counted 9, but I think that last one had actually already come out of the thread. But I might just remeasure it to be safe anyway. So we've now got the new O-rings, new gasket, and finally have this spacer and grommet installed that wasn't there originally. So then we can call that part done. Now let's go and have a look what came in that water pump kit. It looks like this kit comes with pretty much everything, so we're not going to need to reuse any of it. The whole entire old pump housing, everything just gone. Comes with a brand new one. So I'll pull all these bits out. Obviously our impeller, new base plate, new housing. So we'll put the old impeller, old housing aside, old base plate, the old O-ring that was under the impeller. Now it looks like this bolts on, so we need to sort of assemble the housing a little bit, and we get what I'm presuming is a set of new bolts for that. So new woodruff key for the impeller, a couple of screws which I presume are to put the housing together, and then new bolts with some Loctite on them for putting the housing on the gearbox. According to the instructions, it appears that this adapter that goes on the top is for outboards that have a 1/2-inch water pipe coming out of it. So I'll check that. I presume the easiest way is to measure off the old one. So it seems like this configuration is what we need. This base plate, there's a separate tube here, and then there was a rubber seal that's got a lip that goes onto here. And that's what the outboard used to have. It was pumping water nicely, so that's what we're going to use this time. There's also another rubber seal that goes on the top here where the drive shaft comes through. So we'll pop that on. And now we've pretty much got a carbon copy of what we originally had. Doesn't look like there was any sealant or anything on this before. Can't really go anywhere because it's pressed down and wedged between the outlet pipe and the pump itself. So a couple of little flathead screws hold this on. So old one, new one. You'll also find in these kits there's a little O-ring that goes inside the housing before you put this actual impeller cup in. The kit came with the cup seated inside here, so just be aware that you'll need to take this out and pop this O-ring in the centre before you put it together. Here's a bit of a shaped O-ring that goes in the bottom of the housing here. So I'm going to put a bit of grease on the O-ring to help it seal, and also just to hold it in place while we'll assemble it. Stops the O-ring popping out, not sealing, getting pinched and cut, that kind of stuff. This O-ring's got quite a distinctive kink in it where it makes this turn, so I'm starting at that point. Then the rest of it's essentially just a curve that follows the pump around. Next thing to go in is the new base plate gasket and the new base plate. But before I can do that, I need to scrape all the old base plate gasket off. Now the bulk of it's off, I'm just going to get a finer razor blade and scrape a bit more, and maybe a bit of wire brush. Looks like the service manual calls for a coating of sealant on this gasket, both sides of this gasket, for the base plate as well, so do what it says. While that sealant dries on the base plate gasket, I'll do the intake grills and the retainer for the bearing carrier. As well as being a bit damaged, particularly the other side, these intake grills have now been painted over with a bit of primer, so perfect time to replace them. Once you've got the screw out from this side, you need to take the screw out from the other side. They're quite long and they're staggered, so one screw goes in this one into the far side, up high, then the other one goes the other way, down low. Once they slot in, you can put the screws in, but it's just occurred to me I'm actually going to put a coat of the Evinrude white on this, so I'll leave these off for now and I'll put them on when the painting's finished, but you get the idea how easy they are to swap. I will put this missing retainer in though, which has got a 1/2 inch fastener on it. Alright, that was nice and easy. Now let's go and finish the water pump. Gasket's been drying for about 10 minutes. So we'll drop this on. With the gasket on this way, the bolt holes don't line up at all, so I'm just going to flip it over. That's perfect, so it's obviously not symmetrical. Now I'll just pop the base plate on top of that. Obviously, same issue with the base plate. If you drop it on, the holes don't line up, flip it over. Now I'm going to put that little sort of woodruff key section in and the O-ring. The woodruff key is this tapered shape like this. If you imagine the drive shaft looking down and you imagine turning clockwise, you want the pointy end to be pointing clockwise. Where is it? There. Then I'm going to put a little bit of grease on this O-ring and slot it on, and we're going to slide it down until it's halfway across the woodruff key to hold it in place. So here, woodruff key with the narrow end pointing clockwise, and the O-ring just half over holding it in place. Now just a little wipe of grease again on the inside of the impeller just to help it slide down. You can tell which way this impeller goes because the open side has to go down so it can slide onto that woodruff key there. The closed side here goes up. When you slide these impellers down, I like to have a look where the woodruff key goes and just know it's this particular fin. So once I know which blade it is, I can keep an eye on that blade and know that I'm aligning that blade with the woodruff key. Then as it goes down, so much for the O-ring holding it in place. I'll bring you in close again for this because this can actually be a little bit tricky. Those woodruff keys, even with the O-ring holding it in place, if they catch up, they'll just push out. So you need to keep an eye on that and make sure it's still in position by the time the impeller's all the way down. So, woodruff key in position, got the O-ring there. This is the blade that has the gap for the woodruff key. You can see here though, this woodruff key is actually popped down and out. So I'm going to try and use a screwdriver to keep it in place while I get the impeller down. There we go. So, it's locked on with that key. There's a bit of play in it, but it's definitely hitting a point where it can't turn any further. And once the impeller goes on, it pushes that O-ring off the woodruff key down onto the base. Now I'm just going to put a little bit of grease on the inside of the impeller housing just to give it a bit of startup lubrication. As I drop the housing down, I'm going to turn the drive shaft clockwise to make sure that those impeller fins bend the right way. So just turning them with a bit of downward pressure. It's quite a large impeller on this outboard, so it takes a fair bit of force to get it down, but it's getting there eventually. Once you've got those nuts sort of fastened up on the impeller housing, you're pretty much done. The instructions also talk about lifting the drive shaft up as you rotate it to seat the impeller lower down on the shaft. Apparently that improves the impeller or the pump efficiency, so a nice little final step, I guess. That wraps things up for this video. We've now on this gearbox got a new prop shaft seal, new drive shaft seal, and new gear selector O-rings. So I think we're going to solve this problem of water getting into the gearbox now. The only other real possibility is just the little O-rings or washers around the drain plugs for the gearbox oil, and they're fine as well, so I think we're good to go. Well, thanks for watching. I hope this video helps you if you have this problem or need to do this job on your gearbox. I hope this video also shows you a bit about that sort of early start when it comes to obtaining the parts. In the past, I've always just sort of started the video and go, look here, I've got these parts. But as you can see, if you go to a site like marineengine.com, it's pretty easy to order parts by just knowing what's the exact model of your outboard and then looking through those diagrams. I find those exploded diagrams give me much greater confidence that I'm actually going to get the parts I need, compared to ringing up and trying to describe them over the phone. I also find they're a really good resource if you've got a little bit of doubt about how things go back together. Jumping on and looking at those diagrams can really help you out there. Alright, well take care and I'll catch you next week. See ya. Bye.